Welcome to the Bogosity Podcast for the 15th of October 2012, the podcast that follows the recipe to the letter and still blows up the kitchen. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's pull the rug out from under the news of the bogus. With pretty much every government endeavor, you can always rely on its quality. To be low, that is. Government programs tend to seek the lowest common denominator, but so rarely do they make this explicit. But when Annika Eriksson, head cook at a school in Falun, Sweden, started producing quality meals, she found this out directly. Eriksson provided quality meals to the students at her school by baking the bread fresh every morning and offering a wide range of vegetables on a buffet. She also offers them a choice of proteins in chicken, beef patties, and even shrimp. And she provides special smorgasbords on Easter and Christmas, all while staying within the government's budget. But as it turns out, bureaucrats don't like it when you show them up. That's right, her municipality has ordered her to stop making quality food because she's making the other schools look bad. They're saying it's, quote, unfair to have her serving quality meals when all the other schools serve crap. According to Eriksson, quote, it has been claimed that we have been spoiled and that it's about time we do as everyone else. Listen to local school stooge Katarina Lindberg try to spin it. Quote, a menu has been developed. It is about making a collective effort on quality, to improve school meals overall, and to try and ensure everyone does the same. No, Lindberg, if that were really your goal, you'd be asking Eriksson what she did right, and figuring out how to implement that in the other schools. Now, Eriksson is forced to use store-bought bread and cut the veggie selection in half. For the good of the students, you know. Parents and students both are outraged. The school's fourth graders have even launched a petition to protest the decision. But here's the thing everyone needs to know. The government is not concerned with quality. They're concerned with equality. Instead of having the different head cooks innovate different ways of improving quality without increasing costs, they insist that everyone be the same. And since government itself has no way of improving quality, then what happens, as always does with equality measures, is that the lowest common denominator is reached. Instead of everybody being unequally well off, they're all equally worse off. And that's all government can ever do to produce equality. We've heard a lot about ridiculous, unjustifiable shootings by police, and how they just get away with it no matter how extreme. 'Cause, you know, he might have been hiding an AK-47 or a howitzer in his jockey shorts. It really makes you wonder what kind of extreme scenario would be enough to make the shooting so obviously unjustified that there'd be nothing the police could do except sigh and accept it. Well, let's see. What if the man being shot was standing palms open and arms outstretched? What if the man were deliberately going to the police station? What if he were clearly in a state of distress, in need of police, so much so that he banged on the window to deliberately get their attention? And what if we know he wasn't hiding a gun anywhere because he was naked? What if we even have all this on video? But I'm just being silly. Such a ridiculous scenario could never actually happen. And if it did, there's no way any police officer would fire on him. And even if he did, there's no way the police department could possibly say it was justified. Right? Hate to break this to you, but this is exactly what happened to Gil Collar when he was fatally shot by Travis Austin, a police officer with the University of South Alabama Police. Collar had apparently taken, or was given, LSD, and was in such distress he sought the help of the police. Many details, such as why he was naked, may never be known. But according to the police, the shooting was justified because Collar was on a violent rampage, and Austin had no choice but to shoot him in self-defense. But the thing of it is, there's video of the event, and although the police have refused to release the video, it was seen by Jeer Beasley, attorney for the Collar family. The police later played the 2-minute video for the press without audio, and here's what it shows. Collar begins walking slowly to the door of the campus police department. He walks away but soon walks back and pounds on the window. He walks away again. That's when Austin came out with his gun already drawn, pointing it at Collar, who responds by holding out his arms with his palms open. Collar kneels, but then gets back up and moves toward Austin, who backs away. They move into the yard. Then, less than 30 seconds after Austin came out of the police station, he shoots Collar in the chest. And Sheriff Sam Cochran says it was justified. Quote, "In my opinion, it was proper to come out with a gun." Yeah, because that's what you should do with a naked student clearly in distress and wanting the police. Why, he might be Wolverine and he's hiding adamantium claws. According to Beasley, quote, "I can tell you without reservation, nothing we saw on the videotape justified the use of deadly force in this case. I have seen nothing to indicate to me that you ought to go out there with a raised gun against a guy who's buck naked, unarmed, and in distress. The fact that he came to the police station indicates that he was not necessarily looking for trouble. In fact, I think he was looking for help. But now we'll never know." Investigators are now trying to determine who gave Collar the LSD. They say that person could be arrested and connected with his death. Here's the interesting and outrageous thing. Alabama is one of 46 states with the felony murder rule, which says that if someone commits a felony and as a direct or indirect result of that felony a death occurs, the person can be found guilty of that person's murder. Alabama statute specifically says that the person is guilty of Class A murder punishable by life in prison or even death. How much of a travesty of justice would it be if the person who gave Collar the LSD got convicted of his murder while Austin got off scot-free? Of course, what we keep hearing from all these cases of cops shooting first and never even bothering to ask questions later is that they're all just isolated instances. But one wonders how many isolated instances you can have before it becomes a pattern. Case in point, 2 Texas police officers are being sued for using a taser to shock 50-year-old Scott Sheely, who was suffering an epileptic seizure, which resulted in him having a heart attack and suffering permanent brain damage. No, this wasn't a mistaken identity. No, this wasn't a drug raid gone wrong. No, this wasn't the cops getting the wrong house. Police were specifically responding to a 911 call to get medical assistance for Sheely, and they arrived before the paramedics. They found Sheely in the midst of his seizure and violently restrained his movements, restricted his breathing, and shocked him with a taser several times. According to the legal complaint by Sheely's brother Dustin, the police were, quote, "pushing a knee in his back while he was in handcuffs, causing his head to be pressed against the back cushion of the chair, all while he was still convulsing. Dustin repeatedly and helplessly told the police to stop, but they continuing to taser him after he'd been handcuffed." In this state, the paramedics arrived and gave him not epilepsy medicine, but Haldol and Ativan, antipsychotic medicines which can also cause seizures. That was when Shelley had his heart attack. According to the complaint, quote, "As a result of being improperly restrained, in particular after concurrently having received Ativan and Haldol, the plaintiff suffered respiratory arrest and ceased breathing. As a result of the respiratory arrest, plaintiff suffered cardiac arrest. It took paramedics 11 minutes to revive him and get his pulse back. Sheely continues to suffer from respiratory and cardiac arrest, lack of oxygen, loss of vision, brain injury, and pain from his numerous wounds, not to mention severe emotional anguish. What's it coming to? Are we approaching a time when someone in dire need of medical attention says, whatever you do, don't send the police? How bad would that be for people who are supposed to protect and serve? As bad off as it is here, it's disheartening to think that many other countries have it far worse. Malala Yousafzai is a 14-year-old girl living in Pakistan who's made a name for herself as an activist for women's rights, especially the right to an education. She made a name for herself writing extensively about the extremists who used fear and intimidation to force girls to stay at home instead of going to school. Last November, she became the first ever recipient of Pakistan's National Peace Prize. The extremists responded by trying to assassinate her. They shot her once in the head and again in the neck. Fortunately, the bullet missed her brain completely, so she's still alive, but in critical condition. The Taliban have claimed responsibility and have threatened to kill her if she survives. The Taliban released a statement saying someone who, quote, campaigns against Islam and Sharia law is ordered to be killed by Sharia. Malala is targeted because of her pioneer role in preaching secularism and so-called enlightened moderation. But in reality, that will not get them what they want, because Malala's words are preserved and echo all over the internet. Last year, she told CNN, quote, I have the right of education. I have the right to play. I have the right to sing. I have the right to talk. I have the right to go to market. I have the right to speak up. God will ask you on the day of judgment, where were you when your people were asking you, when your schoolfellows were asking you, and when your school was asking you, why I am being blown up? It also won't get them what they want because it will only foster more negative feelings against Islam, the exact opposite of their stated goals. Meanwhile, a bounty of $100,000 has been offered to anyone who catches the culprits. The Taliban called Malala, quote, the symbol of infidels and obscenity. If that's the case, then go infidels and obscenity! Because apparently the infidel and the obscene have much more integrity and humanity than these religious nutbars. Here's hoping Malala makes a full recovery. If she does, and if she continues to speak out against oppression, then by all rights she should be considered one of the greatest heroes the world has ever seen. Now it's time to cancel the angular velocity of this week's biggest Bogon emitter. And this week, it's Bonnie Kavoussi of the Huffington Post, who was so butthurt on behalf of the Fed that she decided to write a column debunking 11 myths about the Federal Reserve. What she didn't seem to realize is that if you're going to write an article debunking myths, the first step is to actually make sure they are myths to begin with. She doesn't hold back. In the article title, she directly refers to them as lies, and in the first sentence refers to those opposed to the Fed as haters spreading rumors. We'll take these rumors, myths, and lies one by one, starting with, the Fed actually prints money. Quote, it's true that the Fed is in charge of the money supply, but technically the Treasury Department prints money on the Fed's behalf. Really? You're going there? Right off the bat? Come on, if you talk to any economist in the world about printing money, he'll know what you mean, the expansion of the money supply. The word printing has simply become a euphemism for this, whether it's done literally by printing new bills or by changing numbers in a computer. Printing money refers to the creation of new money in the economy without it being backed by a commodity. Does she really think that all these economists and bankers and pundits think that every single new dollar is actually printed on paper? This is ridiculous. We also use the phrase, create money out of thin air. That doesn't mean we think Bernanke is Jamie Ian Swiss. Oh, and if you want to get picky, which apparently she does, the money is actually printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. So she can't even get a fake correction right. Next myth. The Federal Reserve is spending money wastefully. Quote, the Federal Reserve actually has created new money by expanding its balance sheet. The Fed earned $77.4 billion in profit last year, most of which it gave to the U.S. government. Yeah, it's not spending money, it's creating money. Yeah, that's totally different. Most economists regard this as an informal tax. With an actual tax, money is taken from people by the government and put into the Treasury, there to be spent on the politicians' pet boondoggles. But with money creation, real value is taken from everyone's bank account. Even though the nominal amount of dollars doesn't drop, the value of those dollars do because you now have more money chasing the same amount of goods and services in the economy. Econ 101. And really, why brag about the Fed turning a profit? If I could legally print my own money, I'd always be turning quite a tidy profit too. I'm $100 in the hole? No problem, I'll just print $200 and I'm in the black again. And the last bit about the Fed giving its profits to the U.S. government is a non-point. The Fed is required by law to do so. They keep enough of the profits for their operating budget, and the rest goes into the Treasury. We still have 9 to go. What are the chances she'll get 1 right? Myth number 3. The Fed is causing hyperinflation. Quote, but inflation is actually at historically low levels, and there is no sign that is going to change. Core prices have risen just 1.4% over the past year, according to the Labor Department, below the Federal Reserve's target of 2%. We'll start with the myth itself. The Fed is causing hyperinflation? Who even says this? This is a complete straw man. Fed critics are afraid of future hyperinflation, fearing that if we don't act quickly enough, we'll have hyperinflation down the road. So what use does it do to point to the current inflation rate to try and refute this? And what, pray tell, are core prices? Basically, it's the price of everything except what ordinary people like you and me actually buy. There are no groceries, no gasoline, no clothing, none of our everyday purchases, and very few, if any, of our annual purchases included in the market basket. The only reason why inflation isn't any higher is because banks are holding the new money in reserves. The money has to actually enter the economy to have an inflationary effect, and when it does, the fact that we're in a fractional reserve system will cause a multiplier effect and make the inflationary effects of creating that much money much larger than they ordinarily would be, perhaps 10 times as much. Myth number 4. The amount of cash available has grown tremendously. Quote, some Federal Reserve critics claim that the Fed has devalued the US dollar through a massive expansion of the amount of currency in circulation. But not only is inflation low, currency growth also has not really changed since the Fed started its stimulus measures. She just hasn't seen the figures. Either that or she's being incredibly dishonest. Currency growth isn't the same as monetary growth. Even if we just stick with M1, the basic count of money in the economy, it's increased dramatically since Obama took office, from $1.57 trillion in February 2009 to $2.36 trillion at the end of September 2012, an increase of 50.3%. In order to get a 50.3% increase ending in February 2009, you'd have to go all the way back to May of 1995. M1 has grown as much in the last 3.5 years as it did in the previous 14 years. Myth number 5. The gold standard would make prices more stable. Quote, Representative Ron Paul has claimed that bringing back the gold standard would make prices more stable, but prices actually were much less stable under the gold standard than they are today. This is just laughably untrue. The source she points to for support only mentions one brief period in the 20th century after FDR made it illegal for people to hoard gold, in other words, to actually trade it for money, except in very small amounts. To look at the period before the Fed, we can look at the book Money, Whence It Came, Where It Went by John Kenneth Galbraith, no fan of the gold standard by any measure. Yet he writes on page 2, quote, in the last century, that's the 19th century, in the industrial countries, there was much uncertainty as to whether a man could get money, but very little as to what it would do for him once he had it. In this century, that's the 20th century, the problem of getting money, though it remains considerable, has diminished. In its place has come a new uncertainty as to what money, however acquired and accumulated, will be worth. Nowadays, the dollar is only worth about a nickel of 1913 money. So one wonders what Miss Kavoussi is thinking here. Myth number 6. The Fed is causing food and gas prices to rise. Quote, there actually is no correlation between the Fed's stimulus measures and commodity prices, according to some economists like Paul Krugman and Dean Baker. Well, if our sources are nutcases like Krugman and Baker, all I have to say is, well, there's your problem. This podcast has reported before on the correlation between commodity prices such as gold, silver, and even neodymium and many other metals, and the price of gas. She mentions the stimulus. So let's talk about the price of gas during that time. In 2006, before the crisis, gas averaged $2.59 a gallon, and gold averaged $603.46 an ounce. So 1 ounce of gold would have bought you about 233 gallons of gas. In 2011, gas prices averaged $3.53 a gallon, and gold was $15.71.52. So an ounce of gold would have actually bought you 445 gallons of gas. Gas is cheaper in terms of gold than it was before the crisis hit. And this makes perfect sense. In a recession, people cut down on unnecessary expenses, and that includes gasoline. For things like going on vacation, people don't do as much, and demand drops. How does this hold out over the long run? Well, if we go all the way back to 1975, when gas averaged 53 cents a gallon, gold averaged $161.04. So that 1 ounce of gold would still have bought you about 300 gallons of gas. They do fluctuate differently short term, but over the long run they just don't diverge. Plotting out one in terms of the other ends up with a graph that's pretty much flat. Myth number 7. Quantitative easing has not helped job growth. Quote, some Federal Reserve critics claim that the Fed's stimulus measures have destroyed jobs, but the Fed's quantitative easing measures actually have saved or created more than 2 million jobs, according to the Fed's economists. Oh yeah, nice to get an independent source there, Kavoussi. Never mind that it was Fed economists who said all through 2005 and 2006 that there was no housing bubble and real estate fundamentals were solid. Yeah, let's listen to them. This is the same tactics we see homeopaths resort to. When the patient fails to get better, they say, but without us, the patient would have gotten much worse. When you start from the assumption that homeopathic medicine works and the patient fails to get better, the only possible conclusion is that the patient would have gotten worse without the treatment. The idea that homeopathy is complete bogosity never even gets considered. Confirmation bias. It's the same thing here. They start with the assumption that the stimulus creates jobs, and when it doesn't, conclude that jobs would have been lost without the stimulus. Nowhere in here is any way of falsifying the main assumption. Of course, what actually happened is what the critics of stimulus predicted, and the proponents of stimulus never even mentioned as a possibility: stagnant growth. So this actually fits the predictions of the Fed's critics, and not the Fed economists. Myth number 8. Tying the US dollar to commodities would solve everything. Who says it would solve everything? Are there people saying a gold standard would stop global warming, or an asteroid strike, or drownings? Anytime someone makes a claim that the myth is that X solves everything, you're pretty safe guessing it's a straw man. What Fed critics do say is that a commodity standard would improve the monetary system. But I guess that's too difficult for Kavoussi to refute. She does say, quote, "But this would actually cause prices to be much less stable and hurt the US economy overall." I guess, if you consider exponential growth to be stable and zero long-term inflation unstable. Myth number 9. Ending the Fed would make the financial system more stable. Quote, "But the US economy actually experienced longer and more frequent financial crises and recessions during the 19th century, when the US was using the gold standard and did not have the Fed." There just isn't any way to juggle the numbers to make this statement true. Even if we're being completely generous and ignoring the Great Depression and World War II, the economy since World War II hasn't been exactly gangbusters compared with the history of this country pre-Fed. According to George A. Selgin, William D. Lestrops, and Lawrence H. White in their paper, Has the Fed Been a Failure? Quote, "Although contractions were indeed somewhat more frequent before the Fed's establishment than after World War II, though not, it bears noting, more frequent than in the full Federal Reserve sample period, they were also almost 3 months shorter on average and no more severe. Recoveries were also faster, with an average time from trough to previous peak of 7.7 months, as compared to 10.6 months. So while you might be able to make the case that the Fed has increased the time between recessions, although you'd have to cherry pick away the Great Depression and World War II to do that, it's actually given us longer recessions and slower recoveries. And this is better how? Not only that, but the periods between recoveries and the next recessions showed slower economic growth than the corresponding periods pre-Fed. And even then, it's extremely doubtful that the recessions of the 19th century were caused by the lack of a central bank. First of all, we did have a central bank for quite a few years before the Supreme Court struck it down. Second, the fractional reserve system has a lot to do with it, and that's always existed in some form, finally being formalized in the National Banking Act of 1862. Myth number 10. The Fed can't do anything to help job growth. Quote, "Many commentators have claimed that there simply aren't any tools left in the Fed's toolkit to be able to help job growth, but some economists have noted that the Fed could target a higher inflation rate to stimulate job growth." Wow. Really? The Phillips curve? Really, the Phillips curve belongs on the pile with a flat earth and healing wounds with unicorn tears. The Nobel Memorial Prize for Economic Sciences has been given over the decades to no less than 9 scientists whose work, at least in part, disproved the Phillips curve, the trade-off between inflation and unemployment, in both the short and the long run. Which is very unusual. It would be like giving the Nobel Prize to James Randi for proving yet again that homeopathy is bogus. But in the field of economics, the Phillips curve is an idea that just won't stay dead. It's failed and failed and failed again, and most economists now consider it a joke. But a few just won't give up. And sadly, they mostly seem to be Fed economists and political advisors. And finally, myth number 11. The Fed can't easily unwind all of this stimulus. Quote, "Some commentators have claimed that the Fed can't safely unwind its quantitative easing measures. But the Fed's program involves buying some of the most heavily traded and owned securities in the world, Treasury and government-backed mortgage bonds. The Fed will likely have little problem finding buyers for these securities, all of which will eventually expire even if the Fed does nothing. But economists have noted that once the Fed decides it's time to unwind the stimulus, the economy will have improved to such an extent that this won't be an issue. Does that last sentence sound like wishful thinking to you? Yeah, me too. Look, no one doubts that the Fed can find buyers for these assets. This is more straw manning. The real question is about how much the Fed will be able to sell them for, and what will the reaction of the market be at the time. If the Fed were to dump all its Treasury assets right now, all at once, the result would be higher interest rates and dwindling bank reserves, probably with a lot of the inflation that's been building up behind the dam all this time. Of course, the Fed won't do that, but it may be a difference between ripping off the bandage slowly or all at once. And if the economy hasn't recovered at the time, well, so much the worse for all of us. So not only did she not support any of her so-called myths with sound economics, most of them were completely contradicted by economic theory. And some of them aren't even genuine myths, but straw man arguments. After all that, how could anyone other than Bonnie Kavoussi possibly be this week's biggest Bogon emitter? And now it's time to expose the implausible undeniability of this week's Idiot Extraordinaire! And this week, it goes to Congressman Paul Broun of Georgia, who reminds us that idiotic religious extremists aren't just a product of the Middle East. Listen to what he said recently in a speech before the Liberty Baptist Church Sportsman's Banquet.
But God's Word is true. And I've come to understand that. All that stuff I was taught about evolution and embryology and Big Bang Theory, all that is lies straight from the pit of hell.
Really? Well, isn't it just amazing how these lies from the pit of hell stand up to independent verification and pass testable predictions, when your Bronze Age collection of primitive ramblings that you put so much stock by can't even get the solar system right?
And it's lies to try to keep me and all the folks who are taught that from understanding that they need a Savior.
Maybe because we don't? This is the terrible, horrible, sociopathic, misanthropic, and downright dehumanizing thing about the Christian religion. It takes all the parts of us that are good, the social aspects, the altruism, caring, compassion, and so on, and rips it out of our very hearts to attribute to an invisible man in the sky, trying to convince us that we need that invisible man to have those things. And the things that are base and hateful means that we're corrupt and beyond hope. And only that invisible man can save us. And the things that are at the core of humanity, such as the desire for sex, or good food, or whatever, is lumped in there with all the bad stuff, solely for the purpose of convincing us that our most overwhelming desires, neither good nor bad on their own, are proof that we're horrible and rotten and disgusting. No, we aren't. What's horrible and rotten and disgusting is any religion that tries to make us believe that we are.
You see, there are a lot of scientific data that I found out as a scientist.
Really? You're a scientist? What's your PhD in? What was your graduate thesis? In what peer-reviewed scientific publications has your original research been published? Oh, look at that. It looks like none of them. Gee, I wonder why. Let's check his CV. Oh, look. He doesn't have a PhD or any kind of science degree at all. He's a doctor of medicine. What was that he just said about lies being born in the pit of hell?
It actually showed that this is really a young earth.
Really? And what in your practice of general medicine led you to contradict basically every single finding of geology, cosmology, biology, and nuclear physics?
And what I've come to learn is that it's the manufacturer's handbook is what I call it.
Really? It's supposed to be a handbook for the world, and it thinks that bats are birds and rabbits chew cud?
It teaches us how to run our lives individually.
Let's look at some of its advice on that, shall we? Exodus chapter 20, verse 17. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Hey Brown, are you a free market guy? Your Bible says you shouldn't be. Deuteronomy 22, 28 through 29. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married, and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. Hey Brown, you're a congressman. Have you introduced a bill to this effect? Make rape punishable by a fine to the father and forced marriage? Why not? Don't you believe what your Bible says? What about Romans 13, 1 through 5? Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. So, Brown, do you think Barack Obama is God's servant and you should do everything he says? If we looked at your voting record, would we see this? And here's an uncomfortable one. Matthew chapter 19, verse 21. Jesus answered, "If you want to be perfect, go, sell your possessions and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come, follow me." Have you done this, Brown? Everything you own? Are you homeless and without any possessions because you gave them all to the poor? No? Why not? I thought the Bible teaches you how to live your life individually, so why aren't you following it? I can keep going, but you get the idea.
How to run our families.
Yes, it does. It's right here in Matthew chapter 19, verse 29. "And everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and inherit eternal life." Not to mention Luke chapter 14, verse 26. "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." Sometimes it's just too easy.
How to run our churches.
Yep, here we go. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 through 35. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. So, Brown, do you make sure women follow this rule in church?
But it teaches us how to run all of public policy and everything in society.
Yeah, well, fortunately we have this thing called the Constitution, so that the hateful, tyrannical, anti-woman, anti-family, murderous, infanticidal, and genocidal commandments of the Bible have no form of expression whatsoever in our legal system.
And that's the reason as your congressman, I hold the Holy Bible as being the major directions to me of how I vote in Washington, D.C., and I'll continue to do that.
Scary, isn't it? That someone who believes this and insists that every single word of it is literal is one of our lawmakers? Oh well, at least he doesn't have any disproportionate control over our science policy. Oh, wait a minute, he's on the House Committee on Science and Technology. How did that happen? How does someone who denies every single scientific discovery since Newton get such a position? It's amazing. As we close in on the election, I wouldn't have thought I'd see 2 weeks go by without either Obama or Romney getting this booby prize. But it seems that there's no shortage of boobs in this country, and for all of their lies, misstatements, and downright idiotic claims, the fact that we have Paul Broun out goofing all of them with his insanity means that, as pathetic as it is, only he could possibly be this week's Idiot Extraordinaire! Well, that wraps up this scientific, pacifistic, non-specific, quite horrific, too prolific, hieroglyphic, trans-Pacific, and gee, your hair smells terrific edition of the Bogosity Podcast. Please visit the forums of Bogosity.tv, where you can read the show notes and join the discussion on these and other subjects. This podcast is free but not free to produce, so please use the donate button at the top of the Bogosity.tv website or down the right-hand side of the podcast page and give generously to keep this podcast going. And if you'd like to contribute to the podcast, just send a question, statement, news article, or rant to podcast@bogosity.tv. Put it in an audio file, and if it's good enough, it'll get played right in the podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from the Bible. "But ye are forgers of lies. Ye are all physicians of no value." Job chapter 13, verse 4. The Bogosity Podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 3.0 Unported License. Bogosity. Do you want answers to creationist claims against evolution? Would you like to know more about evolution yourself, or even engage creationists more directly, with actual peer-reviewed sources to back you up? My book, How Evolution is Scientific, is designed to show the basics of evolutionary theory and how it is so well supported using the scientific method. It's impeccably sourced, with references to the actual scientific material, and is arranged using the creationists' own criteria of what is scientific. Using their own arguments against them, see how evolution is scientific, but creationism is not, based on observations, accurate predictions, logic, and evidence. Get answers to common creationist claims, and even a primer on abiogenesis, the start of all life. It's all in my book, How Evolution is Scientific, available at Amazon and on Kindle, EPUB, and PDF as well. Get How Evolution is Scientific and never be taken in by creationists again.